There's been a lot more conversation around the idea of giving a minimum wage to rideshare drivers, and what's going on in Minneapolis is really interesting. The rideshare company Lyft says it will be forced to stop operating in Minneapolis on April 1st, so this is a month from the time of this video, if a minimum wage ordinance passes. I feel like they do this a lot, I'm not gonna lie. When anything happens that Uber and Lyft doesn't like, I don't know if this is a game of like chicken, if they're going to call their bluff or whatever. Will this actually happen? I don't know. But I know this was something in California when Prop 22 was a conversation about rideshare drivers being independent contractors or employees. A big thing Lyft and Uber said was like, oh, we could, be removed from, or we're going to leave cities if this happens. They do this all the time. I'm not going to lie, it's kind of annoying. Reminds me of that scene in South Park where Cartman's like, F you guys, I'm going home. I can't really do a good Cartman impression, by the way. But anyway, this happens a lot, so this is kind of annoying, but this is interesting because you have a minimum wage now in California and in New York City, right? So this is something that's not a new conversation, right? I've done a bunch of videos like this, but this is interesting because I feel like Minneapolis isn't necessarily what you consider a heavy-hitting city or an area for ride sharing, but like I've said in numerous videos, this could have a massive trickle effect around the rest of the country. Like it's already happened in California, in New York City. This has been a talk in other places. You can see right here that according to the company, the ordinance would nearly double prices for rides in the city. Is that going to happen? It's tough to say. Now, I talked before in previous videos, right? I haven't done a big update video about Lyft and Uber in a while. I was in New Orleans for Mardi Gras, and then I was busy finishing up a bunch of challenges, right, for some of my other YouTube channels. But this is kind of interesting to me because, like I mentioned in previous videos, like a couple weeks ago, is all they had to do in New York City was tack on a $2 extra fee for delivery, for example, when it comes to Uber Eats drivers and DoorDash drivers. So I feel like, would it really double the prices for the city? Tough to say, right? And they say right here that more expensive rideshare prices could impact ride volume, meaning that drivers would end up earning less even though people are paying more, or even though there are higher pay rates in terms of the rides, right? Now, this is something right here that you can see that the Minneapolis City Council committee advanced a proposal that would guarantee a minimum pay for rideshare drivers, or reviewed effort after Mayor Jacob Frey, butchered that a little bit, vetoed a similar measure last summer. This is something I did hear about before. This is not the first time I've heard about Minneapolis in terms of them pushing something forward when it comes to rideshare driving. And like I've said in numerous videos, rideshare driving is in this right now unique category of not being full employees and not really being independent contractors. It's this gray area, which I'm calling independent contractor with benefits, both in a literal sense, like health benefits, like I just did a video about Lyft healthcare and stuff like that, but also in a figurative sense because they're getting certain perks that you really don't get when it comes to most independent contractor jobs. And under the plan, drivers would be paid $1.40 per mile and 51 cents per minute, while transporting passengers, and would make no less than $5 per ride. They would also keep 80% of fees for any council requests for service. That's a little steep, I'm not gonna lie. I mean, that's a tough one because you never know. Stuff just happened. At the same time, we've all been there where like, so you pull up to someone's house, you say, hey, I'm here, you call them, you text them, you're waiting outside for 5 minutes, you're like, all right, I just drove 10 minutes here. It was supposed to be a decent paying ride. I waited 5 minutes, and then the cancellation fee you get is like $5 or $10. And you're like, oh, great, right? Right here, the proposal mirrors language that Frey vetoed last summer, right? But without rules about when drivers would be deactivated or kicked off the platform because of policy violations or criminal convictions. The new ordinance would take effect on April 1st. So this is happening very soon if it receives the full council's approval, right? It's tough to say that basically a lot of the rideshare drivers, and this is, I mean, I've had a million videos about this, right? Talk about the struggles that in terms of making ends meet as gas prices have been higher, inflation has increased in the recent years. I've talked about this before, that drivers are making less money than ever before while paying more money than ever before for just general expenses, gas, maintenance on your car, etc. But then also the amount that Uber and Lyft is taking out as a cut is also higher than before. I mentioned before in a bunch of other videos, when I first started driving, it was pretty much a hard cut. I never saw anything above this 20%. If I made $100, Lyft and Uber gets $20, I get 80. I was very happy with that. I'm like, all right, that makes sense. They made the app. They find me the people. I don't do anything. I hit a button and I do everything, right? So, and right here is representatives of both Uber and Lyft. So I want to stress, even though this article started off by saying Lyft, this is for both, of course, that they warned the companies would cease operations in Minneapolis if the ordinance passes, and it could threaten services in the entire state. I mean, that's tough to say, right? So I'm not exactly sure that that Uber at the time said the legislation would increase costs to customers by 30%. I don't know. Now, what's tricky about this is it is tough to say what exactly would happen. I mean, I've said this before. My favorite quote of all time is, knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is knowing not to put it in a fruit salad, right? One thing happening on paper is very different. Sometimes it's crossovers, of course, but sometimes it's very different of what something's actually going to look like in practicality. And I haven't really done any updates about Lyft and Uber. I know, like I said, in a while. I was at Mardi Gras, I mentioned that, I think, a few weeks ago. And then I had a bunch of other stuff going on with, like, YouTube projects. I'm finishing up some new music. So I haven't really done any, like, Uber and Lyft news update stories in a while. I will say that. But this is an intriguing one to me. And I'll tell you why. Is because I've mentioned in a lot of videos, I think there should be a federal mandate for a minimum wage or a minimum hourly guarantee for rideshare drivers, right? And I mentioned before as well, and this is all super important for this video of what's going on here, that back in the day, I believed that rideshare drivers should be employees. That was my personal belief, and I've kind of taken that back. I used to think that. Now I think rideshare drivers should be independent contractors and should stay as such, yet have more benefits. And I think that's kind of the tricky thing, that I feel like that rideshare drivers, in a lot of ways, even though they are on paper, in a sense, being classified as independent contractors, the companies and everything treat them almost like employees. Like, they're milking them like employees and treating them horribly. And the work culture of ride sharing is very different than a lot of other independent contractor jobs. I think this is why ride sharing is always this asterisk on any bill that gets passed when it comes to independent contractor stuff or employee stuff or whatever. Like here in California, like I've mentioned a bajillion times, AB5 passed, which kind of went in depth about like freelance workers, independent contractors, etc. The only workers there was a unique clause to that, which was Prop 22, was rideshare drivers, right? So this is something that's not new of bringing this up, because if you think about it, there's really no other industry. I mean, there's probably maybe something out there, but when it comes to the gravity of rideshare driving, and I personally consider rideshare drivers and essential workers. I genuinely do. And so there's really no other industry that has this kind of big impact on the whole weighted discussion, both in the legal terms, the financial terms, of being an independent contractor or an employee. And so a big thing that I've brought up, like I said in a lot of other videos, is a guaranteed minimum wage. And it's interesting that in California, when it passed, it was kind of this kind of stranglehold. I mean this in a good way for Lyft and Uber, where it was like, okay, they have to be either independent contractors or employees. Either way, they get a minimum wage. And Lyft and Uber didn't really argue that as much, right? There was some conversation about them pulling out or whatever. But then it happened in New York City, and Lyft and Uber made that work, right? Especially like I mentioned in a delivery driving video, for example, all they had to do was do one, they tacked on an extra $2 fee when it comes to deliveries, when it comes to Uber Eats and DoorDash and Grubhub, etc. And two, they allowed people to tip at the end of the delivery, not in the beginning, right? Which to me, I hate to say, makes more logical sense. I'm not gonna lie, and I mentioned this before as a side note. There's been times I ordered Uber Eats, and my order got there perfectly, and I made sure that they were properly tipped, and I always have been a big tipper. However, there's been other times where my order was definitely, it almost looks like purposely messed with, and I'm like, I should not tip them the big tip that I did give them, right? So this is that kind of, so that is also more related to delivery driving, but they made it work in New York. Now, Minneapolis, I do understand when it comes to America, which is kind of frustrating, I guess it's bittersweet, maybe how you look at it, is that you have federal stuff or nationwide stuff, and then you have state stuff. And I do understand that, like, say, state to state when it comes to rideshare driving is very different. I've said before, I haven't really said it in a while, but in almost every video, when I first started making videos on this channel, I said, your location is the number one factor that determines how much money you can make. So I do understand that the climate and the economics of ride sharing in each individual state, sometimes even city to city, is vastly different. So California, I do understand, is a very different economical structure compared to, like, say, Minneapolis. And so this can get, I know, a little bit tricky, At the end of the day, though, I feel like this is something that should be a federal thing. I think that with everything going on now, it's not that unreasonable to put this into place. Now, I do know that Uber and Lyft says two main things that brings up, I think, a valid point, and it could be valid. I genuinely don't know. I think this one gets tough. One, them saying, oh, you know what? Screw you guys, we're going home. We're not going to have operations exist anymore. Both Lyft and Uber will probably say this. I think it's kind of annoying. I feel like, now granted, who knows if they call their bluff? I don't know what would happen. What would genuinely happen if Lyft and Uber did pull out? I think that could have a huge impact. I mean, I genuinely cannot imagine if in anywhere, like say whether I'm here in Los Angeles or another place, if it genuinely happened where like say Uber and Lyft said, you know what, we're gonna stop operations in this area that you're in. I use Lyft and Uber all the time, but mainly, I'll be honest, for mainly going out, like obviously I have a car, so I will say that. But for like say some people like say who are elderly or handicapped or disabled, getting around is not easy. If like say you just don't have a car and you've done the math out, and I know some people who do this, they're like, hey, I actually have done the math. It's cheaper for me to take Lyft and Ubers than to buy my own car and have insurance on this kind of stuff. Let's say you have an issue with your credit, which doesn't allow you to get a vehicle. So I think Lyft and Uber is super important for a lot of people, and I can't imagine the impact that would have if they did pull out. As far as I know, I don't believe, and let me know in the comments if I'm wrong about this, I might be, I don't believe Lyft and Uber's ever actually pulled out of a city that they existed in the sense that I don't think I've ever heard of Lyft and Uber being in an area, and then they're like, you know what, this is not working, we're just going to leave, and now no one can take a Lyft and Uber anymore in that area. So the first thing of them saying we're going to pull out, they say this all the time. I've heard they say this a million times, not just in California and New York or Minneapolis, but like, I don't know. We'll see what happens, right? If that actually just happened. This is only a month away, right? But I think this is a pretty big case because the reason why I'm very interested in this one specifically is one, it is, if they do pass this, they are calling your bluff, and I don't think any other area has done that. I think every area's been like, all right, shoot, we can't have Lyft and Uber pull out. Fine, okay, we won't pass this. And that's happened in every case. So I feel like this could be the first time that someone says, you know what, we're going to do it. Up to you guys, and see if Lyft and Uber does actually pull out or not. So that is going to be an interesting thing to see what will happen. Another thing I think about it, that I mentioned, is when it comes to the ride-sharing, like, mega hubs of the country, California and New York are the biggest. This is the first one that isn't considered like a heavy hitter. And so I think in a small area like this, I mean, this could have a massive ripple effect. Like I've said, if this happens, there could be other conversations. And like I said, I predict, and I may be wrong, that maybe, 5 years, 10 years, it could be a federal thing. I look at this kind of in a similar way, although very different industries, very different things, very different niches. Similar to what's going on with weed and marijuana, right? Like legalization. That it was just, Colorado and Washington, I think, were the first two states. And then California, and then is it legal in New York now or Massachusetts? I think Massachusetts, I know. So at a certain point, I feel like with most of the country moving towards that realm, at some point, they might just say, you know what, we're going to put in a federal thing. Granted, I know this is a bit of a discussion from a political side that it's definitely like a blue state versus red state. I know like Democrats are more for legalization. Republicans are less for it. I feel like ride sharing is not involved in any political stuff, right? So this could be a bipartisan thing, which maybe means it will be pushed forward quicker. I don't know, right? Definitely a subject for a whole other video, but I do think that this is a big thing that one, like I said, are they going to pull out or not? I don't know, right? Second thing is the increase in how this is going to affect drivers. I think this is a big telling sign of what could actually happen in practicality if this does go through. Because I know Lyft and Uber saying, oh, well, drivers are going to make way less than they did before. Tough to say. On one end, you could argue, let's be honest, they might just say that because they're trying to say whatever they can for this not to pass. Of course, it's no surprise Lyft and Uber does not want this to pass. Of course, right? So that definitely goes without saying that, like, Lyft and Uber's like, all right, like, we're going to say whatever we can as an excuse. Now, granted, that could be true. I think it's important to look at both sides. Maybe it is true. Maybe it is true that although a guaranteed minimum wage sounds legitimate, it could be true that if, like, say, this does go forward, even if customers are paying more, Lyft and Uber has to pay more stuff in general, which means drivers get less, or even, which is potentially possible, it's always important to look at every kind of situation, that maybe a lot of customers say, you know what, shoot, I would take an Uber right now, but now I'm not going to because it's so expensive. I'm not going to take an Uber. And then there's less rides in general, which equals less rides for drivers, which means you get paid less. One thing though, I know in terms of the economics that I think is that when it comes to a minimum wage, the way it typically works is this. You get a minimum hourly guarantee. Anything above that is yours. So let's say it's a, I'm going to have a sip of water, excuse me. Throat's a little scratchy today. I usually drink a lot of water before I film videos, but you never know. Anyway, but let's say, for example, it's a minimum wage of $15 an hour. If, let's say, you make 18, nothing happens. You make 18 bucks in that hour, which I feel like the average amount that a driver makes, like I've said before in other videos, is about 20 to 25 an hour. That's what I found. However, if, let's say, you make $13, Lyft and Uber out of their own pocket has to give you an extra 2 bucks. So you go from 13 to then 15. Here's the reason why I don't see this as, at least to me, and granted, maybe there's a bunch of other factors I didn't know of, and there probably is. But to me, if the average amount that a driver's making is $20 to $25 an hour, which means that if there was a minimum wage of, let's say, 15, I don't think Lyft and Uber would have to worry about this as much. Now, let's say they said, look, the minimum wage is $25 an hour. I can see this, the mathematical stranglehold of being like, shoot, like, most drivers don't make that. Lyft and Uber's going to have to shell out a ton of money out of their own pockets just to kind of pay these drivers because they're not making enough to hit that minimum threshold. But because most drivers, like say, and I don't know what the minimum wage is there, and I don't know how it would be passed, I don't know the exact economics behind it, you know, if it's actually similar to New York City versus, like say, total hours versus active hours. That's a whole other thing that's happening in New York right now. And Lyft and Uber and delivery driving has the option to choose which one. When it comes to this, it's like, I don't know exactly what it is, to be honest, and, you know, mention it in the article, but I'm like, if it's, like, say, a minimum wage of $15 an hour, I feel like, at least to me, unless it's, like, a horrible time to drive, I feel like most rideshare drivers, at least during peak hours, would never get less than 15 an hour. I could be wrong, though, right? So maybe that's why Lyft and Uber says, hey, we didn't have a problem with this in California because drivers make more. But in Minneapolis, we know that they don't make that much money, which means we're going to have to kind of like shell out more money than we typically would in another area just because of the economical differences between one state versus another, right? That could maybe be their concern. I genuinely don't know, but this is something to look out for because this could be the first time in history that Lyft and Uber potentially does leave an area. This could be the first time that ever happens. This could also be the first time that we see how will this have an impact on not just a big heavy hitter like California or New York, but how would having a minimum wage or a minimum hourly guarantee have an impact on a less big heavy hitter, right? Or less commonplace when we think of the big place to make money when it comes to ride sharing. I think this is going to have a bigger, I think this is going to be a bigger sign of evidence compared to most places, because let's be honest, when you think of like what are the biggest cities in America, Los Angeles, New York. I feel like those are the top two biggest cities, let's be honest. Yeah, you have Boston, Miami, Chicago, etc., but I think New York and California for sure are the biggest, and they usually have been shown to have the highest rates of paying their rideshare drivers. So those are very different climates, but this is the first one they said, okay, when it comes to a less popular city or area, how would this have an impact on it? And how would that be maybe a good piece of evidence or good representation of how it would affect other places in the country, right? How would it affect other places in the country if they followed suit with what's going on here? Because I feel like this is more relatable, right? A lot of cities are not New York or Los Angeles. Actually, pretty much every other city is in New York or Los Angeles, of course. But like, you know, I think this would have a good representation of a normal city of what would happen when it comes to economics and what would happen on actually the practicality elements. We'll have to see. All I'm going to say is this could be a bigger case than I think most people can expect, just in terms of how it relates more to the average city in America. And this could have a huge impact. One, if let's say this does go through and it works well, that minimum wage could be a lot more feasible for a lot of other areas that are on par, let's say, with Minneapolis. And the second thing is if this does go through and Lyft and Uber does leave, what would happen? Would they come back? I don't know. There's a lot of kind of unanswered questions here. We'll have to see what happens in a month.